In July 1932, the Democratic Party met to nominate the candidate for president. The candidate they chose was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, this was a party that had won only 4 elections in the last 72 years prior to that time. And Roosevelt wasn't known as a progressive. He had been governor of the state of New York. He was known sort of as a political lightweight, actually, and also sort of what they called at the time a trimmer, a hedger. He tended to try not to take very clear stands. For example, prohibition, which was a big issue. Roosevelt personally opposed prohibition, but he refrained from the campaign to ever taking a stand on it. But he won the election. But when they met in Chicago in July of 1932, that's where they met. Does anybody know what the unemployment rate was in Chicago at that time? 45%. 45% of the Chicago labor force was unemployed in July 1932. By the election in November, the national unemployment rate was 23.6%, and non-farm unemployment rate somewhere over 30%. By the way, I put a bunch of summaries of what I'm saying on chairs, but I only had 50. And there's 5 chairs up here that have those summaries that nobody's sitting in. So Roosevelt came into office, and within the first few days in office, he said to his staff, I want to put 500,000 young men, and it was young men in this formulation, to work by summer. Now remember, we're not talking January. He comes into office in March, because back then you came into office in March. I want to put 500,000 young men to work by summer. The military said it's logistically impossible. You cannot do it. You just can't do it. Roosevelt thought about this for a couple of days and said, because he just pulled the 500,000 number out of the air. He was not an economist. It was just a number that sounded nice to him. So he said, okay, 250,000, go do it. And by summer, June, they put almost 300,000 people to work. What Roosevelt did in a sort of cut and paste mixture of job programs over the 1933-1940 period was bring the national unemployment rate down from 23.6% to 14.6%. The largest single drop in peacetime. And this occurred even though he made a pretty fundamental economic error in 1937, going back to try to balance the budget, and the unemployment rate went back up. He learned that that wasn't the right thing to do. Now, I'm telling this story for 2 reasons. One, because to understand how bad things can get. I'm not saying we're going there, but things will probably get worse. Obama's correct in saying things will probably get worse before they get better. But 2, illustrate what political will, both on the part of leadership and grassroots movements, can accomplish at a time when people were really desperate. Well, we are in another time when concern for jobs and employment is at the forefront, and everyone is in favor of jobs program. I should say almost everyone. There are a few people whose salary is paid by the federal government, whose very comprehensive health care coverage is covered by the federal government, and whose retirement is guaranteed by the federal government, i.e. Republican senators, who are not at all sure that we should use the federal government to create jobs. But setting them aside, let's talk about what a jobs program should look like. And I'm part of a group, as James mentioned, called the Chicago Political Economy Group. We put together a proposal, which I said there's 50 copies of a summary of it on the chair. I'm sorry there aren't more than that. And I'm going to try to just summarize very briefly the nature of the jobs proposal. The first point, because my wife says you can only make 3 points. The first point is that any jobs program has to deal both with the spike in unemployment and the general growing unemployment during the Bush administration, but we think also with the long-term structural inequalities in the labor force in terms of gender, race, and ethnicity. That is, we have a chance, because of what's happening politically, to deal with both aspects of unemployment together. By the former, by the spike, I mean, for example, that under the Bush administration, unemployment rate has increased by 84% from the time Bush came into office to when he left office the other day. We lost in 2008 over 2.5 million jobs alone. For the longer term trends that we also need to address in the jobs program can be summarized just in a couple of numbers. Full-time working women, median wage for full-time working women is about 67% of that for full-time working men. The median wage for full-time working African Americans is about 63% of the full-time working wage for the white population. So we have these structural inequalities, long-term inequalities, that also we have a chance to address. The core of our program that we're talking about is to create a net of 4 million new jobs each year over the next 5 years. That would be double the Bureau of Labor Statistics projected employment growth. And probably they have had to change those projections by now given what's happening in the economy. This is considerably more than what the current proposal that the Obama administration is working on, which is called the American Recovery and Reinvestment Plan, which would generate about 3 million new jobs at the end of 2010. I do think events are going to force them to think bigger. But part of what we're trying to do is expand that universal discourse so that there's a space that Obama can move into and actually have a more all-encompassing program. So the first point then is a jobs program should address both the loss of jobs under the Bush administration and the longer-term structural inequalities in job loss. Labor force participation rates have been going down for the last 15 years because a lot of people who would take jobs have given up looking at them because they can't find a good job. Second point, we think the jobs should be created, should be good jobs, quality jobs. They should be jobs that are tied into the long-term economic well-being of this country. So there's sort of three areas of employment that our plan talks about. First is what, sort of the standard one, social investment in infrastructure. Transportation, building bridges, roads, light rail, regional airports perhaps, but also refurbishing health and educational facilities. If you ever walk through Cook County Hospital, you know there's lots of work that can be done to improve the facilities. If you walk through some of the cities, some of the schools in parts of the cities that are poor, you know there's lots of work we could do. That's infrastructure building. That will primarily generate construction jobs. Construction jobs will be disproportionately white male. So that's why we're saying we need to have more than just that kind of focus. Secondly, an expansion and upgrading of public sector employment, particularly in the areas of health and education. CNAs, people in elder care, people in child care, nurses, teachers, teachers' assistants, and those jobs will pick up a different sector of the labor force, more predominantly women and minority. So we need to, and there's certainly a need. It's not that we are overwhelmed with a surplus of people in those kinds of jobs.